Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Did everybody have a good lunch? Ready for the second part of the day? Today, we're going to continue our focus on cybersecurity, cyber defense, and we're going to talk this afternoon. We're going to begin with cybersecurity and encryption. Our first guest is a legend in the world of encryption. He was named by PC World as one of the top 50 visionaries of the last 50 years, and he is on stage today to talk with us. And I guess we don't really need much further ado. If you could give a warm round of applause to Mr. Phil Zimmermann. Welcome.
Have a seat.
So, I guess we sit here, right?
We'll sit here. Nice and formal-like. So I'm Eric Hesseldahl of Recode, and this is Phil. Just Phil, no.
All right.
It's been kind of interesting to be in the green room because I've seen a few times people wanting to get their picture taken with Phil, have them sign copies of User's Guide to PGP. So I think I want to kind of, before we get into some of the more current things, I kind of want to start at the beginning, and this is a story you've probably told 1,000 times, but I'd like to hear it from you. Why and how did PGP happen?
You know, in 1991, when I released PGP, it was originally a human rights project. There was no strong encryption of any sort available. In fact, the strongest products at that time used 56-bit DES as their block cipher.
Which was basically, I think Brock Meeks used to call it the equivalent of a Captain Crunch decoder key.
Well, for most attackers, 56-bit DES was not so easy to get through at the time, but for any nation state or any large company, it would be possible to get through it. But companies at that time didn't really face a threat model that worried them about that. They were concerned about protecting their own stuff from their business rivals. And their business rivals did not have any significant cryptanalytic capabilities. But that was in 1991, and that was also the time that the Cold War was coming to a close. And when the Cold War ended, there was, in the 1990s, there was a kind of a surge of globalization. And companies began to do business in all over the world. You know, they would open up facilities in countries that have cheap labor markets, which are also the countries that also had oppressive governments and were aggressive signals intelligence environments. And so it started to shift through the course of that decade that companies began to face a threat model that was more similar to the original threat model that PGP was designed for, which is, you know, for human rights applications, PGP's threat model was primarily nation states, you know, the two superpowers in the context of the Cold War, or their client states with the assistance of the superpowers. So PGP started to become more of a business tool as the threat model for business began to have a little bit more resemblance to the threat model of human rights applications. And so at that time, you know, the government also tried to put me in prison for developing PGP. And so for 3 years, I was the target of a criminal investigation. And this had the unintended side effect of making PGP more popular.
It's what drew me. I didn't know anything about encryption or anything. And when I first started reading about your case in the 90s, I was in my 20s and a young journalist, and I was like, this is actually a really important conversation, because the internet was just really beginning to take hold in society, and the notion that we could have the same privacy as whispering in your ear, as the say was going, in your digital communications. That seemed fundamental to me. And so I credit, you know, that whole time with my awakening. It was probably very stressful and a pain in the neck for you, but it was very interesting and very helpful to a lot of people.
You know, at the time in the 90s, one of the principal motivations of PGP was primarily about civil liberties. it wasn't so much for business, as I said, it was for human rights. And the internet was not a very dangerous environment. In the 1990s, the internet was, mostly for academics, and gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail, and it was a much more benign environment. But today, and in fact, even in the early 2000s, we started to see the internet become increasingly hostile, and so it wasn't. Now it became important to use strong crypto to protect your communications, not just for civil liberties, but for business, for protecting against organized crime, to encrypt your files, so that if somebody breaks in and steals your files, they won't be able to read the files. And so there became more and more business rationales for it. And when I finally started a company, PGP, in 1996, and started selling it commercially, the only people that would be willing to buy it for money was enterprises.
Right.
I mean, the PGP was free before that, and so the consumer market doesn't really pay very well. In fact, they felt entitled to use the free open source version. And it's funny, you get these libertarian sentiments where they say, give me liberty or give me death, but don't ask me to pay $50.
I'm curious. I want to see a show of hands in the room. How many people go to the trouble of routinely encrypting their email? 1, 2. Okay, that's a pretty fair show of hands.
This is not a random sampling, though.
This is not a random sampling. This is a motivated crowd, I grant. But I think it's useful. So it's good to know. So let's fast forward a little bit to Silent Circle and Blackphone, which is your new venture. You're the chief scientist. Did I get that title right? I got it wrong earlier.
Well, Blackphone is not a company. It's a product that Silent Circle, it's one of Silent Circle's products.
Right. So, and it's the one that I always associate with it, but Silent Circle is really the company, and you have apps that run on iPhone, Android, et cetera, and those do what?
They do secure telephony. Look, I've been interested in secure telephony for longer than I've been interested in secure email. It's just that I had to do secure email first because it wasn't the technology infrastructure that enables any telephony on the internet, whether it's secure or not. It just wasn't there in the 90s. Nobody had broadband.
Right, and yet you invented Z-Phone in what, 96, 97?
Well, that was PGP phone, actually.
PGP phone.
And that was in 1995, and then it became commercially available in 96, but I think we sold probably, I don't know, 100 copies. Because nobody had broadband, and there were no standards for carrying telephony on the internet, and so there was just no market for it.
So Silent Circle app, it's video calling, voice calling, messaging all in one.
Yeah, and you can send encrypted attachments. And we manage the keys end to end. We don't have any key material on the servers. That means that if somebody were to hack into our servers and get control of our servers, they would not be able to extract any cryptographic keys that would help them decrypt the traffic.
So how did Silent Circle start? I think this is an interesting story.
Well, I got a call from a guy named Mike Janke. He was a former Navy SEAL. And he wanted to make a tool that lets U.S. military service members call their families when they were deployed overseas. And I said, yeah, I could do that. Sure, I know how to do that. Mm-hmm. And so, but of course, he wanted to sell it to other markets as well.
Right.
But I think that was the scenario that motivated him to start thinking about the problem.
Because it was difficult for the deployed personnel to call home.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Pentagon would tell them not to use Skype, and not to use this and not to use that, but they didn't have any advice on what to use. They just had advice on what not to use.
Yeah, interesting. So then what happened? You get Silent Circle out the door, and then there's also the product of the Blackphone, and they were kind of related but not?
Well, Blackphone was originally a joint venture with a company that built Android phones called Geeks Phone. It's a Spanish company. And we ended up buying out the joint venture, so then Blackphone became a product that was owned by Silent Circle. But you know, the Blackphone is a hardware Android phone that runs Silent Phone, which is an app that you can get from the Google Play Store, or you can get it for iOS from the App Store.
Right.
And you know, most people use it as an app rather than buying a Blackphone.
Basic use case is the most common use case.
Yeah.
Is using it as the app. So then you made an interesting observation earlier today, and earlier here. You said consumers, by and large, aren't a very good market for encryption. So your primary customer base.
We focus on enterprise.
Enterprises and large companies.
I mean, enterprise includes government. I mean, we do have military users. We have, as I said, we sell to Navy SEALs. And Navy SEALs would not use a product if there were any backdoors. So all this discussion today, the encryption debate that we see, a resurgence of the encryption debate about putting backdoors in products, Navy SEALs are not going to use a product that has backdoors.
Right. So then, and the companies that are using it, their basic argument for using it is what? They're in, say, the oil and gas industry or security or something else.
Well, you know, companies in a global economy are all over the world. They're working in environments that are very hostile environments. They're aggressive wiretapping environments. They're working in places where there's a lot of corruption, and they're worried about their communications being secure. And so we have end-to-end secure communications. You know, we use protocols that only negotiate the keys between the two endpoints. We also publish the source code so everybody can look at it, just like PGP. That's what we do.
That's an interesting thing, because I think a lot of people in this room are probably interested in finding ways to secure their communications, whether it's for themselves or for their companies. And I'm curious, from your perspective, I mean, you talk about publishing source code. Where does someone start in evaluating some of these tools and products that are available? Because there's a lot of them.
Well, when you say evaluate, you got to recognize that even though we publish the source code, just like PGP published the source code, is that these days source code can be so big that nobody has the time to sit down and read through it all themselves. I mean, you know, governments can do that, but average individuals don't have the time to do that. So it's not that consumers are going to go through the source code. It's just that you can sleep at night knowing that someone else is doing it.
So simply publishing is not enough.
Well, it's table stakes. You have to do that.
You have to start.
At least that,
right.
Yeah. And we publish, you know, we publish the protocol. We publish the source code, and I don't recommend that people buy cryptographic products unless the source code is published. It's not only because of backdoors, it's also because of just, you know, bugs. I mean, you got to be able to see the weaknesses. I mean, open source, in theory, open source is supposed to make it possible to find bugs in the software. But we've seen that this is not always the case. I mean, for example, the Heartbleed vulnerability that was found in OpenSSL was there for a long time, for years.
Yeah.
And so even though source code was published, it doesn't mean that enough eyes are looking at it to find it in a reasonably short time.
One has to wonder how long Heartbleed was in, and if you're not familiar with this, just Google Heartbleed, it'll make your eyes bleed, actually. How long it was in existence, and made me wonder who might have known it was there and put it to use.
Well, you know, it depends on whether the intel agencies had spent enough time looking at the source code to find it themselves. I mean, they probably found it, but who knows, you know.
Yeah, that was always kind of my assumption. So let's talk about some of the current events that, I mean, the battles that you fought and the people around you fought in the 90s, particularly in the US, around the right to encrypt, the right to actually offer encryption
Well, yeah.
software.
You know, it's funny. We went through the crypto wars in the 1990s, and we did it on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, in the US, we had export controls on crypto. There were no domestic controls on crypto in the US, but the FBI was attempting to impose domestic controls with the Clipper chip. This was a hardware chip that the government would manufacture, and they would put this in everybody's phones if you built secure phone products. But every chip had a unique key in the chip that was backed up in a vast government database for wiretap purposes. And oddly enough, to the FBI's shock and dismay, it did not achieve market acceptance. It's
If
amazing.
the FBI wants something, I kind of think I don't want it.
Yeah, yeah. And so that was the end of you know, that was their that was their ignominious defeat in imposing domestic controls in the U.S. on strong crypto. The export controls, it took longer to end those. We had to fight through the entire decade of the 90s to get rid of those. And that was in 2000, in early 2000, when the White House finally dropped the export controls. But by that time, the French had already dropped their domestic controls. The French actually had a lot of domestic controls on crypto, but they dropped theirs in the late 90s because they wanted to encourage the adoption of the internet in France so that they could get some economic benefit from e-commerce. They were looking at the success of the internet in the United States, and they wanted to get the economic benefits of that, so they recognized that they would have to end their domestic controls on cryptography. The British had a combination of domestic and export controls. Both the British domestic controls were not as aggressive as the ones in France. They were just trying to find ways to limit crypto in Britain. But all these three countries, the US, Britain, and France, were the sort of triumvirate of countries that were trying to impose controls on cryptography, both domestic and export controls. That all came to an end by the end of the 90s. And after that, we see the deployment of strong crypto in all kinds of products, in every web browser, in mail clients. When you connect to your mail server, you go through TLS, PGP, you know, GNU Privacy Guard, all kinds of products, whole disk encryption, all kinds of products started emerging that became entrenched and an indispensable part of the economy. And so the legislative environment today favors strong encryption. In the 1990s, if you were using strong encryption, there was a stigma associated with that. People would ask you, "Why are you using strong encryption? Are you a criminal?
What do you have to hide?
What do you have to hide? You must be up to no good. Are you a drug dealer?"
Yeah. Do you remember when people would ask you that if you just had a pager in the 90s?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Why do you need a pager? Are you a drug dealer?
Yeah. So, but today, if you don't use strong encryption, now you have to explain why you're not using strong encryption. If you're a doctor or a clinic or a hospital and you're not protecting patient records with strong encryption, then you're in violation in the US, of the HIPAA laws. Many European countries also have similar laws requiring the use of encryption to protect patient records. If you're a businessman traveling or you were in a taxi, you'd leave your laptop in a taxi. If you have a couple 100,000 customer records in there, then if you don't have the disk encrypted, then you've just violated the law. You have to reveal to all your customers that you've lost their customer identities. In the U.S., that alone is enough to hurt the company. But in Britain, they even have additional penalties, civil liabilities, maybe even in some cases criminal liabilities. So today, the legislative environment favors strong encryption. So things have turned around completely from the 1990s. And so here we are. It's been like 20 years, and things have totally shifted around about the legislative environment around cryptography. However, what happened is that as the 1990s played out, and we had to fight hard to get things to change. We had a near consensus in the United States that it was time to change. This discussion had the participation of all elements of society: journalists, academics, human rights groups, civil liberties groups, the NSA, the FBI, the White House, the courts, the Congress in the U.S. And you had a similar debate happening in Europe, in many Western European countries.
It was really a broad, sweeping consensus about
there was
right
a near
to privacy.
consensus, with the one exception of the FBI. The FBI never agreed with with everyone else, who said, okay. The NSA backed off and just stopped participating in the discussion. Now, in retrospect, we have a clearer understanding of why the NSA backed off, because the NSA realized that they could achieve their goals without trying to limit the use of encryption. It took years for us to discover the truth of that. It's because of when Snowden revealed.
What did you think when the Snowden disclosures came out?
Those of us who work in data security had always expected that NSA would be doing some of those things. But what we saw with the Snowden revelations were so breathtaking in their scope of what the NSA had achieved. It was absolutely incredible. It's vast, sweeping, comprehensive, absolutely breathtaking in its width, its breadth and depth.
I studied some of those PowerPoint decks that they had, and I was pretty impressed.
It is incredible, and it went far beyond what people in the crypto community had thought the NSA would be doing. We had assumed certain things about what their capabilities and what they were probably doing, but we didn't see the sweeping breadth of it and depth of it. And so what's happened now is that the entire computer industry and the software industry and the data services industry have all reacted to the Snowden revelations by upping their game. They now recognize that they have to do better. And so, Google now encrypts the connections between their data centers. Why they didn't do that already, I can't imagine, but now they do it. Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple. And now we see it now in the products. Now smartphones are becoming more and more encrypted. The iPhone is more and more encrypted. Google, did it with Android.
You see more sites requiring HTTPS.
Yeah, data storage is encrypted more, and iPhones are the entire flash memory is encrypted. In fact, that's the basis of this the FBI Apple conflict.
Yeah, we should talk. We need to talk about that because that's really in the news right now.
So what's happened is that everybody, including Apple, had upped their game, and because of this, we're now seeing that law enforcement is starting to react to our reaction. The Snowden revelations set off this kind of avalanche of response in the tech industry. That response is being to improve lots of things. The ITF is improving their standards, deprecating obsolete standards, or NIST was humiliated by. It was discovered that a random number generator in one of the NIST standards was
not very good.
Was essentially, standards malware. It was like a really, really bad way to generate random numbers. And those of us in the crypto community knew that it was a bad way to generate random numbers, and none of us used that method for our products. But some companies did use it in their products. RSA Data Security used it in their product called BSafe. And they got paid millions of dollars by NSA to do that. And so everybody who purchased BSafe and put it in their products was generating random key material that the NSA could break. By the way, the criminal investigation that I suffered through for 3 years in the 90s was precipitated by RSA.
Really?
Yeah, by Jim Bidzos of RSA.
I didn't know.
He's the one who persuaded the government to come after me and try to put me in prison.
You were a threat.
So their product, BeSafe, had a backdoor by the NSA.
Yeah.
And they got paid a lot of money for it. That was later. So anyway, this illustrates, again, the importance of not using crypto products unless you can see the source code, because BeSafe did not publish. It was the source code for BeSafe was closed source.
So let's talk about the situation with Apple and the FBI right now. What do you think is going on? I can kind of predict whose side you're going to come down on, but Apple is basically standing up to the FBI. They want essentially a backdoor. They want to create a special version of the OS that can defeat the...
Yeah, I just read a couple of days ago that now the government is threatening to seize the source code from Apple's iOS and the digital signature key that signs the source code, so that the government could then make counterfeit iOS images that could be accepted by any iPhone, and no one would know. It's beyond the pale of that would be an absolutely catastrophic outcome.
Now,
it's sort of like draining the ocean in order to find a submarine. Without regard to the effects on the ecosystem of destroying all sea life.
Right.
We want to find these damn submarines, so let's drain the ocean.
So President Obama has come out and said that he's hopeful that there's some kind of a middle ground between the extremes that Apple and the FBI are kind of finding themselves on. Is that even possible?
I don't think it's possible. For years, people have been trying to find this so-called middle ground, and it's just very difficult to do. Look, you don't have to, even though, look, everybody knows my history, that I was originally motivated by civil liberties to create PGP, but the world has moved beyond the civil liberties argument for strong crypto. It's not just about civil liberties anymore. It's also about the economic necessity of having strong crypto. The internet is an extremely hostile environment, and you need strong crypto to communicate on the internet. You need strong crypto for data at rest, stored data. You need strong crypto for in as many places as you can put it to protect against attack. And that means attack by organized crime. That means attack by hostile foreign governments. That means attack by anybody who is who has got ill intent. And so this is not just a civil liberties argument. This is an argument that we absolutely, we're doing everything we can to protect ourselves in this kind of lopsided battlefield, where even though the cryptography itself is strong enough that, in the arms race between cryptography and cryptanalysis, the best cryptography is now ahead of the best cryptanalysis. But that's only one aspect of data security. The other aspects of data security of, penetrating servers, penetrating laptops or mobile devices, those are still in favor of the attacker. It's a lopsided, it's all offense and not enough defense. Somebody from the US intelligence community said a few months ago that if this were a football game, that between the attackers and the defenders in cybersecurity, that it would be, the score would be, 360 to 290 in the first 20 minutes of the game, because it's all offense and no defense. The intel agencies from the various governments know how to break into each other's networks, but they don't know how to effectively defend against other intel agencies from other countries. So this argument about whether Snowden might have does Putin have the Snowden documents? I don't know if Putin has them, but if he has them, he probably didn't get them from from Snowden. He probably got them before Snowden gave them to the journalist, because he was probably inside U.S. networks already.
Okay. We're coming right up against time. We probably have time for one question. So if you want to ask Phil Zimmermann one question, we've got time for one right here, near the front.
Thanks. I got an email, a question about email. BGP is 25 years old.
would you still say that PGP is the best choice to protect your private and business email?
Yes, I would, given that you're confined just to email protocols. Email itself is based on a foundation that makes it difficult to protect it at the level that I would feel comfortable protecting it. Like, the metadata is exposed. The mail headers have from, to, subject, date, time, the length, and you don't encrypt the mail headers. The mail headers are used to route the email. The metadata, which we've learned in the past couple of years, we've learned that metadata is important. And there's no way to protect that metadata and still use the standard email protocols. If you tried to hide that metadata, the mail won't work. It won't route. So yes, I think if you're trying to protect email using email protocols, then PGP is the best way to do that. And when I say PGP, I'm not just talking about the product known as PGP, which is currently owned by Symantec, because they bought it in 2010. That also means GNU Privacy Guard, which is developed here in Germany. That's an open source product. And there's other products that use the same protocol.
Great.
But I can't even use PGP these days because I walk around with mobile devices, and I don't have any version of PGP or GNU Privacy Guard that runs on my iPad or iPhone or Android phone. So so ironically enough, I can't use my own invention.
On that note, we have to wrap. This has been really terrific. It was great to meet you. So thanks a lot. Let's have a hand for Phil.